Brilliant, that's us live. So hello and welcome to Cognitive Sports Therapy's Time to Talk. And I'm really, really pleased to have James Roast back with us. And you've been on before, James. And this week we were focusing a little bit on youth mental health, which is why I brought you back, James. You're a trained psychotherapist. You work with young people. You work with adults as well, don't you? But,
yes.
But you work with young people and we thought it would be great to just come on together and have a bit of a chat around youth mental health, what we're seeing in our clinics, and hopefully try and create some help and support for people who are struggling with young people in their lives or the young people themselves in this area. You want to say something about, I guess it's been a while since you've been on here, about what you're seeing and seeing in your clinics?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for having me back on. It was such a pleasure speaking last time, and I promise I'll be as succinct as I possibly can. But once I get onto the subjects, I'm extremely passionate about it, particularly children and young people's mental health. And look, it's been a really challenging couple of years, and in terms of from a pandemic perspective, everybody has been impacted in their own unique way. What has been interesting, and I think there's been a level of predictability to it, is as the world has sort of straightened itself out a little bit, we fully expected the presentation of children to start to filter through. I would say since the return to school in September, numbers are... So I've been in practice 15 years. I would say they're unprecedented levels now. I think this is the tip of the iceberg. And I think if I speak to colleagues and other charities and organisations that I work with, numbers are outrageously high. And what we're seeing is that if I go back sort of 10 or 15 years ago, what we would consider to be high level complex patients coming in, whether that be on the inpatient unit or outpatient, these are like day-to-day presenting symptoms now as well. So high levels of eating disorder, high levels of self-harm, dissociated states, high levels of anxiety. We're seeing lots of the term depression used, but I think that's a conversation for another day in terms of anxiety and depression with respect of how it's becoming so easily woven into the fabric of society, and such an use of language, but isn't always the correct terminology to use. So what we and actually can misinform some of these younger people and create more difficult problems with such. But I mean, in terms of EDs and self-harm, bigger numbers coming through.
And I think part of our conversation beforehand is what I certainly see a lot is there's a lot of panic around child mental health. So I often have parents or I have friends who are teachers or in that environment really kind of quite panicked and anxious themselves about what they're seeing amongst young people. And also around the provision, feeling that there is a lack of provision in mental health services for young people who are turned away from the mental health services for not being unwell enough. I hear that story a lot, which shocks me, but it's unfortunately, I think, a sign of where the NHS is struggling in its service provision for the young people. Part of this conversation today was to also try and share other resources that are out there for parents and young people to get support around their mental health, because sometimes they're not getting what they need through the NHS services. But I don't know, do we want to talk a little bit about eating disorders? Because that was something that definitely came up between you and me as something we're seeing a lot more in young people. And certainly I'm seeing an increase in the number of young boys with eating disorders, which is a fairly new thing. And also, I guess, an expansion of what we understand as an eating disorder. So it's not always associated with the low weights that we used to see.
Yeah. So I think that for me, what's really interesting is there was, often there were what we would consider to be the atypical eating disorder patient that often, and you would see in mainstream media, it was the, white, female, underweight, restrictive eating behaviours, excessive exercise, etc. But the plethora of, obviously, the eating disorder spectrum is vast and wide, but also the presenting patients and the difference in demographics coming through is quite alarming. For me, clinically speaking, looking at the drivers behind an eating disorder from a child or young person's perspective is that need and that desire for control. Probably one of the only or last mainstays of their existence, what they can control. So when a young person or child's going through a particularly challenging time, developmental transition or period of crisis, and that is even parking the pandemic to one side, obviously that chaos that is felt internally stimulates that region of the brain that regulates control. And if we feel overwhelmed and out of control, we will initially externalize that and attempt to galvanize a sense of control in our physical world. But if it still feels as though it's slipping and sliding, or more often than not, what I say to the young people is that the problem with life becomes life itself. Their very sheer existence is too much for them. So the last piece that they've got is what they put in their mouth, or what they don't put in their mouth, or what they can purge, as it were. And interestingly, I assessed a patient this morning that you again would not follow an atypical trajectory. Historically, there and actually there was a diagnosis of ADHD in the April. So lots of different unusual components that made up this young lady's presentation, but was beginning to administer purging as a coping tool, as a coping mechanism in a world that was very chaotic for her as well. I think that we know that response, that seizure of control, does release dopamine. We know that it will give a hit. It releases this sense of it releases endorphins. In that momentary space of chaos, there is a reprieve because we have exerted a choice. Short-term measures, nowhere near longer-term gains, but for that young person that's working through this crisis, it becomes almost like a wonder drug, and that addictive quality drives it further and further and further. And as I say, we are seeing purging behaviours, we are seeing overeating, we are seeing restrictive behaviours. There are and equally, as you mentioned at the start, obviously I have a split caseload, both adults and children. I'm seeing a number, and not to go off course here, of adults also presenting with eating disorders, and that is very much on the rise. And interesting, like yourself, do a lot of work with schools, a lot of teachers presenting with eating disorders as well. Yeah. So there is a look. The last 2 years shows in its purest form how little control we have over our existence, and that is in its magnified version. So it's understandable people are reaching out in any way they can to try and regain a sense of control. Coming back into the world as it straightens itself out, I think is alarming and difficult for people to adjust. But yeah, so.
And I think, treating someone's eating disorder is beyond the scope of these videos, obviously. Yeah. We talk often about what's the message, what are we hoping to have as a takeaway from these videos. And eating disorders, from what I see, are one of the biggest disorders which are very secret and hidden. And I think, there's something here to be said about actually recognizing that it doesn't always fit that stereotype of person, being open to getting help, I guess, and reaching out for help, even if you don't fit into that category of individual who is particularly low weight, and that image that we've got of an eating disorder, because we kind of need to be getting to the point of accepting help in order to make a difference, don't we? So it's that moving it from a secret world into asking for help, and taking away the shame and the guilt that's often hidden behind closed doors with eating disorders. I don't know if you add anything to that, or think that yourself?
Well, certainly, absolutely. I think what we're seeing is there's a lot of good work being done currently by a number of different organisations and individuals with regards to breaking the stigma around these atypical eating disorders, and actually those individuals that clearly have an eating disorder, but as you say, the shame and guilt, it doesn't fit within that criteria. And I think this is where a lot of treatment models or certainly services struggle, because the individuals are not ticking that box. And that is extremely upsetting and disheartening. And I think that what we have to understand from an eating disorder is the binary metrics that a lot of systems apply to it. Where if the weight is here, then actually you're not at risk, and so therefore you don't qualify for services. Whereas I think Chris Fairburn is famous for saying that an eating disorder by definition is a disorder of the mind. So therefore we know that there is a mental health issue. It's just displaying in a more biological format, but we can't apply these binary metrics to determine whether someone is deserving of treatment or not. And so we have to, and like I say, there are many charities and there are many organisations that are doing an enormous amount of amazing work to break that stigma and to be able to provide access to a number of individuals that don't fit that stereotypical eating disorder.
So the big one that I follow and encourage people to look at is Beat, the Beat charity.
Yes,
Their stuff's really great. Is there any other resources that we could be pointing people to that you use?
So I've got 5 that I would recommend. So you've got Beat that you mentioned. Mind will cover a variety of different presentations. So Mind would be another one I go to. It used to be called ABC, which is Anorexia and Bulimia Care, but it's now called Talk Ed. So Talk ED, they've rebranded themselves. Their website is talk-ed.org.uk. The National Centre for Eating Disorders, and also Young Minds as well. Those would be my go-tos. There's ones there are some that are more geared just towards eating disorders, and there are those that are more generic around mental health. All come with a variety of different resources and signpost in different directions. And I think that I think it might be Talk Ed that actually offer access to services, so phone services, group-based services.
I think Beat does as well. Actually, I think you can actually speak to people through Beat. They have a phone line.
Yeah, and this is we mentioned before. It's knocking on those doors. It's continuing. It's picking up the phone. It's trying to, that shame or guilt that may be there. It's not about trying to rid ourselves of that, but it's finding space for it and containing it so that we can cultivate enough confidence to seek the help that we deserve to progress through to that recovery stage.
Yeah, and not being afraid to ask for help, as you say, breaking down that stigma a little bit, so that so we know that there's help there, and trying to continue to ask for it. I mean, there's a link across here to self-harm, isn't there? I often think of an eating disorder for some people as almost a form of self-harm for them. Do we use the same services? Is there any other resources out there for people who are self-harming? Any other lessons we can?
I certainly think Young Minds and Mind would be my initial go-to. Again, for resources, you're absolutely right. There is most certainly a crossover, and I would often group from a treatment perspective the mechanisms or the coping mechanisms with each individual presentation as similar. It's a way of regaining a sense of control, as we said before, reprieve, stopping the world for a period of moments. There are some specific interventions that, with regards to self-harm, that people can search. There are a number of different websites out there that will work primarily or focus just on that. I think what we need to be mindful of from a treatment perspective is, I come across recently that a patient who was under the care of someone else, and there was this attention on almost renaming or rebranding the eating disorder as as some sort of a villain from a child's perspective. So it was creating a negative entity that we need to rid ourselves of. There is, and I'm not dismissing anyone else's practice, but in each patient that comes through, it's about finding the right consultant or practitioner to work with. I'm a huge believer of the relationship underpinning the treatment model. I think what we need to be mindful of is each young person or individual has cultivated these coping mechanisms to manage a period of crisis. If we start to create this archetypal villain of an eating disorder or self-harm, we end up dismissing quite a significant part of ourselves, and it ends up creating a friction. It ends up generating a heat internally that can cause a resistance within the progression of treatment as well. So there's an acceptance and an accommodation of what it does, but it is short-term mechanics or coping mechanisms. And with regards to self-harm as well, it provides that escapism. And what I would urge all parents to do, and even us as health professionals, is to gain that level of understanding. Sometimes in society we can be quite dismissive if we don't have enough information about a certain subject. If we can own our own vulnerability with regards to certain presentations, we don't need to fear it, and parents as well. If we can understand it more, galvanize resources as best as we can, we can then look at supporting that young person collectively with others, or find appropriate services too.
I think we talked about that a bit before we came on air, didn't we? About it's the behavior is the thing that shocks us, particularly as parents or carers. You know, the cutting, the kind of weight loss. The behavior is the thing, but actually the need to kind of take a bit of a step back and have a different perspective and understand what's going on can help. And there's that kind of something here about creating some kind of space and slowing down amidst the chaos that can happen around a young person who's in the midst of this kind of behavior. And I guess they're reaching out to the adults around them to help create some boundaries around that, to kind of calm everything down a little bit, rather than be caught up in the chaos of the behavior with them.
It's definitely, all behaviour is a line of communication, and I think sometimes we can be lost in that behaviourist approach of shutting down the behaviour, ceasing the behaviour. But for us as care providers, as health professionals, or parents, and even for the young person, understanding the cause or the drivers behind it will always be the route to recovery, will always provide us the tools to reduce. And it's the quietening of the world that is important for all of us at all ages, particularly a young person. They have come out of a period of latency during the pandemic and the world being much, much quieter. And I read this piece recently where it said that we are re-entering a plague of productivity. And it really is that there is this. There's an amazing book, if you haven't read it yet, called 4,000 Weeks. Excellent with regards to the intensity of our existence, which was written over the pandemic. And this is for the young people as well. There is a delay. They have missed a lot of social developmental cues because they have been out of a system. They've been out of the schooling system in its usual form. So we would expect, and I go on to continue to expect, high levels of discomfort being presented with children and young people going forward as well. But if we can slow that intensity, that gives us an opportunity or a window to begin to understand their world and support them as best as we can. Yeah.
Brilliant. We've run over time, we always do, but it's just a massive topic, and we can kind of circle around, and it'll be great to have you on again another time. But I always say at the end of one of these videos is that, feel free to message us if you've got any questions, and I can pass them on to James. It's a really difficult topic. It may be triggering for some people, and the shock and the panic that happens around these disorders is completely understandable. We're not belittling that or suggesting people shouldn't be overreacting or calling it an overreaction, because I think it's a natural response when your child is hurting. But I think the big message here, hopefully, that we've been able to put across is that there is help out there, that it's worth banging on some doors to get that. I'm very happy to signpost if I can't help you in this situation. And yeah, there is support there for you, and unfortunately it's really common. There's something there, and just knowing that you're not alone in what you're experiencing. But thanks, James, as always, and I hope you have a nice evening, and I will see you again soon. Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you.